Heralded as a court to bring justice for the world's atrocities and the best means to pursue perpetrators of the most heinous crimes. But last week, South Africa gave notice. It wants out of the International Criminal Court.
The withdrawal will take effect 1 year after the Secretary General has received the notification.
South Africa says the court's obligations are at odds with its domestic laws on diplomatic immunity. Last year, it was heavily criticised for ignoring a court order to arrest visiting Sudanese President Omar Al-Bashir, wanted by the ICC for genocide and war crimes, accusations he denies. It's the second African nation this month to make moves to withdraw from the tribunal, with Burundi's parliament voting to leave. Although the UN has yet to be officially notified. The UN says it regrets South Africa's decision, and human rights groups warn pulling out is a mistake that shows startling disregard for justice. But for many in Africa, the ICC doesn't represent their interests, accusing it of bias towards African countries. South Africa is the first country to withdraw from the ICC since it opened in 2002. Of its 124 member countries, 34 are African. Of the 10 inquiries involving countries the ICC has opened, all but one have been African nations. And all those tried by the court have been black and African. The African Union has been a strong critic of the court in recent years, and many countries have threatened to withdraw. But the ICC denies it unfairly targets the continent, pointing out that many of its cases were self-referred, such as Uganda's request for it to prosecute commanders of the Lord's Resistance Army, including fugitive Joseph Kony. The court's chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, who is Gambian, thinks African nations should support the ICC.
Saying that ICC is targeting Africa or African leaders, which I do not agree with. I think ICC is working for Africa and with African victims.
So will other African nations follow suit and pull out of the ICC? And what would be the consequences for international justice? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Johannesburg is Dewa Mavinga. He is a senior researcher for the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. And from Minneapolis, I'm joined by Abdi Ismail Samatar. He is a professor in African Studies from the University of Minnesota. Thanks both so much for joining us. Abdi, let me begin with you. Why is leaving the ICC the right thing for South Africa and other African countries to do?
I think it's first pleasure to be with you. First, I think it's important to think of justice across the globe. What my concern is that there is unequal justice for different kinds of human beings across the globe. So for instance, if you look at what the European Union, and particularly France and Britain, did in Libya, and the cost to human people in that country, and nobody's looking at Tony Blair and Sarkozy and David Cameron as sort of a culprits in that process. The ICC is not looking at it. So if one is going to apply the rule of law uniformly, then I think the Africans should support the ICC. But as long as that law is deployed and applied indifferently, for instance, if you look at Palestine, what has happened there, nobody's being held responsible. So I think there has to be equal justice for the ICC to claim that it's neutral, legal institution.
Okay, Dewa Mavinga, you think South Africa is making a big mistake. Why?
Absolutely. What South Africa has done by seeking to withdraw from the ICC is to abandon victims of some of the most serious abuses and atrocity crimes. South Africa needs to act in line with values that are in its post-apartheid constitution, and also to acknowledge that it has a legacy of being a country that in the past has stood with victims of some of the most serious abuses. So leaving the ICC sends a wrong message, which South Africa should be very careful about, because it does undermine South Africa's standing both regionally and globally as a leader in terms of human rights respect and international justice.
Abdi Ismail Samatar, why do you think it is not a case of Africans actually making use of the court rather than the ICC targeting Africa?
Well, the question is if the International Court of Justice is an international organization that deals with justice and injustice across the globe, then they should pursue all cases, whether they are African or Asian or European or Latin American or whatnot.
But perhaps...
the question here, ma'am, is that Africans are being dealt with separately from from criminal acts that are committed by Europeans and North Americans in different parts of the world. And so what the Africans are pointing at is not to say that we are withdrawing simply because we are being targeted. It's target everybody equally. And that's not what the ICC has done. So the question of South Africa withdrawing does not mean that justice will be abandoned in South Africa, because, as my colleague talked about, the Constitution of South Africa is very, very clear on that. What matters here is that all the victims of injustice should have their day in court, and that the ICC should bring George Bush, Tony Blair, David Cameron, President Sarkozy, and everybody else who have committed crimes against humanity.
But let me ask you, Abdi Ismail Samatar, if not the ICC, then what? What alternative is there? It's not perfect, but must it be completely left behind?
No, I think that Africans as a collective and the AU as a collective should challenge this, rather than each and every country sort of doing its own thing. So if the AU means an African Union, then they should have to frontally confront this. What I'm thinking here is this, is that this is not to say that there has not been no criminality committed in Rwanda, or Burundi, or in Ethiopia as we currently speak, or elsewhere in the continent. But the same kind of crimes have been committed. Look at the sort of things that are taking place in Syria today, and in Iraq, and in Afghanistan. Who is responsible for that? So what the Africans can do is leave the ICC if it's not reformed, and establish then, as is the case in Arusha, Tanzania, an African justice court that will deal with these matters, that will deal with all Africans equally, rather than the European court doing this for them.
Debo Mavinga, can an African Court of Justice provide a proper alternative to the ICC?
Not quite. The idea is that the ICC is a global court of last resort. So yes, there is need for strong domestic and regional justice mechanisms in Africa to ensure justice, but that does not justify doing away with the ICC. We need more platforms for accountability, not less. When you have strong domestic institutions, when you have a strong regional court for Africa, then it means that they would play their role in a complementary function, so that we have both justice at Africa level as well as at a global level, with the ICC being a court of last resort. And that would not, therefore, necessitate moving away from the ICC. It would only mean that victims have more platforms from where they can get justice.
Abdi Ismail Samatar, is that not sufficient?
That's insufficient. That's the usual human rights liberal organizations call. So, for instance, why is the ICC has not gone after George W. Bush? Why has it not gone after
Because they're not
Tony
signatories.
Well, I mean, so the question is, if the Africans are only going to be those who become the focus of the ICC.
But don't we have to respect that they signed on in the first place?
Well, the presumption of they had at the time they were signing was that this was going to be a global justice court. It is no longer that. And so the question is, the powerful countries can abstain from this, and then this becomes sort of the kangaroo's court for people like Africans and Asians. If you like, there's only one Asian case as far as I know, and then most of this is African. So Africans have to withdraw from this and negotiate internationally if we are going to have an international court of justice. If this is a court of justice for the weak, then I don't think it's a court of justice at all.
Deba, if you have a reply, go ahead. If not, I'd like to move on to another topic.
Well, it is important to note that, yes, the global power dynamics come to play, and the ICC is not perfect as an institution. But the scope for reform should be from within and not to abandon the idea of a global court of justice, which is a court of last resort. So yes, there may be valid criticisms about reform, but the solution is not the way South Africa has gone about it. The solution is to ensure that there is greater effectiveness and efficiency within the ICC going forward, but not by abandoning the court.
Okay, Dewa, let me ask you, how is South Africa supposed to uphold its own diplomatic immunity laws if it is a signatory to the ICC? It can't have it both ways.
Well, what is clear within the ICC statute is that it does not bar peace negotiations. And also, the idea is that immunity for heads of states would encourage impunity. So yes, it would be possible for South Africa to ensure that there are peace negotiations within other frameworks, but at the same time, ensuring that there is global justice. What is now happening is that South Africa appears to have chosen good relations with other heads of states ahead of global peace, when in fact, ensuring justice would, in the long term, ensure that you have lasting and sustainable peace.
Okay, Abdias, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I think it's important. The Africans who signed the ICC originally thought this was going to be a global court of justice that will bring everybody to power. They were naive enough in the sense that the Americans have not signed, the Brits have not signed, and so on and so forth. So it's another northern institution situated in the north, making justice for the Africans and others. And so I think there's a rethinking going on in Africa, not to get away from injustice, not to get away from justice, to hold everybody accountable, but it means everybody accountable. And South Africa and others will come back to the International Court of Justice when it proves to be a holistic, inclusive court that holds the powerful and the powerless equally to justice. As long as that's not done, I think Africans will have to rethink this, in my opinion.
Okay. Dewa, let me ask you, the fear now is that the dominoes may have been set in motion, which could lead to the end of the ICC altogether. Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
There is that real fear, yes. And this is the time, we believe, for those ICC member states on the African continent and elsewhere to reaffirm their support for the court at this time. And we believe that it is possible, even at this time, for South Africa to reconsider its view on leaving the ICC, because there are serious questions about the validity of the manner in which South Africa moved out in terms of whether or not it has complied with its own internal laws, for example, because it bypassed Parliament. So it is not all lost. There is hope if South Africa reconsiders and if other states reaffirm their support for the ICC.
Okay, Dewa Mavinga, I'll let you have the last word. I'd like to thank both of our guests so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.